and welcome back to She Investigates, the podcast where we investigate all things weird. I'm your host, Gwen Ross, and today we have a story all the way from Scotland. But first, let's catch up. So I thought today I would kind of go back to TV shows that me and my husband are watching, like mind-blowing shows that we're watching right now. I talked before about Severance and how much we were liking that. And now that we're more than halfway through season 2, I can confidently say that I have no idea what's going on. And I'm starting to get a little bit worried because I don't know how many of you watched the show Lost, but we invested so many hours into Lost and like all of the like mysteries and like things that were unexplained that you just like wanted to know the answers to. And then when we got to the very last episode or last couple of episodes, it kind of just like all fell apart. And like, I feel like none of the questions that we had were really answered. And it kind of just felt like this huge letdown. Like it had been building up to this. And then like, I feel like the writers of the show just didn't know how to end it because they'd written in so many like twists and turns. And I'm really hoping that Severance doesn't end up like that. Like, I hope that they have a plan for this and that they know where it's going and that we're going to find out like all the answers to all of our questions because I have so many theories and I don't want to like say too much here because I know there's people that haven't watched it and I don't want to like spoil anything, but yeah, still mind-blowing, still loving it. The next show that we have been watching is also on Apple Plus and it is called Silo. And it is super good. I think it has 2 seasons. We just finished it. And it's basically set in like this dystopian time where people are living underground in this giant silo because it's not safe to live on the outside anymore. Like there's been some type of catastrophic event that has made it so it's not safe to be on the outside anymore. But throughout the course of the show, you like learn secrets and find out that like everything isn't as it seems. And what I like about this one is actually a book series. So I know that they like have an ending for this one because it's based off of this book series. But one thing that I really hate about like Netflix shows and Apple TV shows is that it takes so freaking long to get new seasons. Like you can go years sometimes between seasons. And by the time you get a new season, like you don't even remember what happened in the last season. So that's the only thing that's been kind of hard about watching shows on like Apple and Hulu and Netflix is having to wait for new seasons. And then the last thing that we just watched is the Ruby Frankie documentary that is on Hulu now. And wow, it was difficult to watch because you just had no idea everything that these kids went through. It's basically a social media influencer mommy vlogger that eventually ended up abusing some of her children. There's way more to the story than that. The documentary, I feel like, was really well done. And some of her children and her former husband both participated in the documentary. So I feel like it wasn't done without their permission. Super interesting stuff, but also just really makes you think about like how much you're sharing online and how much of your life you're putting out there for other people to see. So that was really interesting. And honestly, like it left me and my husband feeling like we like want to be better parents. So if anything, like it's hard to watch, but it definitely left us with a feeling of wanting to do better for our kids and wanting to make sure that our kids feel love in our home. What's coming up that we're going to be watching? I feel like we're the last people on the planet to watch Ted Lasso. But now that we have a subscription to Apple TV, we're going to be watching Ted Lasso, binging all of that. So we're excited about that. A little more lighthearted than the stuff that we have been watching. And then other than that, we don't really have any other things on Night Agent on Netflix is one that we've been wanting to watch. But I would love some suggestions if you guys have any like awesome, either like dramas, thrillers, documentaries, funny shows like Parks and Rec. Like we're into all of that. So if you have any suggestions, go to my Instagram. Let me know what your suggestions are. And let me know if you have watched the shows that we are currently watching so that we can talk theories. And with that, let's jump into today's episode. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most baffling maritime mysteries of the 20th century, and that is the disappearance of the keepers of the Eilean Mor lighthouse. This eerie mystery took place on a small, remote island off the coast of Scotland, and it happened in December of 1900. There was 3 lighthouse keepers, Donald MacArthur, Thomas Marshall, and James Ducat, and they mysteriously vanished from their post without a trace. So what happened to them? Was this a tragic accident, something darker, or maybe even something unexplained? Today, we're going to be talking about every angle of this and every theory. So grab your headphones and prepare for a chilling journey into the unknown. The Flannan Isles rise like jagged teeth from the cold, restless waters of the North Atlantic, a cluster of Rocky Mountain outcrops battered by waves and wind, far from any inhabited shore. And for centuries, sailors gave these islands a wide berth, whispering about strange things that were happening there, unnatural things. And these islands, though barren and largely uninhabited, they had been kind of shrouded in this weird folklore. The local legends told of ghostly figures wandering the rocks at night and eerie sounds of whistling winds believed to be the spirits of sailors lost to sea. There were also whispers of mysterious lights seen far out in the water. Lights that nobody could really explain, flashing and flickering in the distance, far from any human presence. The Flannan Islands are also known as the Dead Islands, and that was long before a lighthouse was built there. It was said that shipwrecks were common in these waters, and a lot of sailors who came too close to the islands never returned. So when they decided that they were going to build a lighthouse on one of these islands, Eilean Mor, it was meant to be kind of this beacon of safety. But it seems that the darkness of the island, the stories, the legends, the history, might have played a part in the mystery that unfolded there in the 1900s. So at the time of our story, lighthouses were manned by keepers, and they were basically responsible for making sure that the lights stayed lit and on. And the 3 men that were stationed at the Eilean Mor lighthouse during this fateful disappearance were experienced and reliable lighthouse keepers. They each had their own history of service in the maritime field. The first was James Ducat. He was the principal keeper, and he'd been in the lighthouse service for years. And he was known for having a steady and calm demeanor. Then there was Donald MacArthur, the second keeper. He kind of had a reputation for being somewhat temperamental and kind of prone to outbursts, but he was very experienced and he had spent a lot of time in isolation, which was part of this job. The third keeper, Thomas Marshall, was the most recent addition to the team. He was strong and reliable, and he'd only recently been transferred to the islands, but he was by no means inexperienced in this job. So despite their differing personalities, the men were all tasked with maintaining this lighthouse and ensuring the safety of passing ships. Their isolation on Eilean Mor, which is miles from the nearest settlement, was a solitary and demanding job, and they had been preparing for harsh winter months. But when a fierce storm hit and the light went out, the men mysteriously disappeared, leaving only their belongings behind and a strange set of haunting logbook entries. The first to notice the light was out was the crew of the SS Archer, a steamer en route from Philadelphia to Leith. On the night of December 15th, the Archer passed the Flannan Islands, close enough to see the rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse beam, warning them of the cliffs ahead. But there was no light. The sea was calm, the sky was clear, the visibility was pretty much perfect, but the lighthouse was dark, its beam was absent, and it was swallowed up by the night. The crew was uneasy about this, but they had their own schedule, so they didn't have time to stop and investigate. So they decided to just report the failure when they arrived in port the few days later. By then, the lighthouse was due to have a routine visit from a supply ship named the Hesperus. Basically, they would go and take supplies. They would take somebody with them to kind of trade out with these lighthouse keepers so that nobody got too burnt out. The lighthouse board ordered the captain of this ship, James Harvey, to set sail for the island immediately. The lighthouse keepers worked in a rigorous and highly structured system to ensure the safety of sailors and ships, especially in harsh, isolated locations like Eilean Mor was. And the ships were typically divided into rotations to make sure that the light was constantly monitored and maintained, regardless of the weather conditions. So this was like a 24-hour job. On December 26th, as the Hesperus approached the lighthouse, it still stood dark and silent, an unlit tower on a barren, windswept rock. The Hesperus crew tried to signal to the keepers, launching flares, hoping for some sign, someone waving from the tower, or even just like a flicker of movement on the cliffside, but there was nothing. So with growing dread, the relief keeper, Joseph Mor, he was put ashore alone to climb the steep weathered steps that led up from the landing to the lighthouse itself. And what he found inside, or rather what he didn't find, would become one of the greatest mysteries in maritime history. Inside the lighthouse, everything appeared normal, too normal. The beds were neatly made, the kitchen table was set, a meal sat basically untouched, plates of salted meat and bread, and a single chair had been knocked over as if someone had stood up quickly. The light itself was in perfect working order. It was filled with oil, the wicks were trimmed, it was ready to shine, but left dark. There was no sign of the three keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. There was no bodies, there was no blood, and no signs of a struggle. Only silence. Joseph Mor, the relief keeper sent to investigate, described stepping onto the island with a sense of foreboding. He later recalled, quote, "I had a feeling of utter desolation, as if I had stepped onto an island where time had stopped. There was no one to be seen, not a sound, only the wind and the waves crashing against the rocks. I felt like I was the only person alive in a place that had been forgotten by the world," end quote. Mor's uneasiness wasn't just born from this eerie emptiness. He was also really worried about staying on the island that night. And I can say I don't blame him. Like, I would be creeped the heck out by this. But he said in another account, the weather was calm, but something about this place made me uneasy. I wasn't sure if I should stay overnight. I knew I was alone, but there was this strange feeling like I was being watched, like something was waiting. And that's when I would have gotten the heck out of there. But he does stay. His words, though, did paint a chilling picture. Mor, standing on the same island as the missing keepers, was gripped with this growing sense of dread. The quiet, the isolation, just this inexplicable stillness of the place gnawed at him. And it was as though the island itself held a dark secret, and he was afraid of what he might find if he stayed any longer on this island. Also found inside this lighthouse was a logbook from the keepers, and this just added to the puzzle and the mystery of their disappearances. The entries that were written by Thomas Marshall described strange and unsettling occurrences in the days leading up to their vanishing. The logs detailed powerful storms battering the island, even though the weather reports from the mainland indicated that things were calm, that there was not storms. One entry speaks of severe winds, the likes of which I had never seen, while another noted that James Ducat, the principal keeper, had grown strangely quiet, and that William MacArthur, who, as I mentioned before, he was known as being like this tough guy, like a hardened man, he was reduced to tears. But perhaps the most chilling entry simply reads, quote, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all," end quote. So when the Hesperus crew discovered the empty lighthouse, Captain Harvey decided we need to send a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board and let them know what's happened. So on December 28th, the first official telegraph from the island was dispatched, and it read, "The three keepers are missing from the lighthouse. We have searched the island and found no trace, no sign of a struggle. The light has not been functioning for several days. Request immediate assistance." And this message sent a shockwave through the lighthouse board. But what was weird was that there was no sign of a struggle, and it kind of sounded calm from this telegraph. It didn't sound like there was any type of desperation or urgency. And the eerie calmness of the message, it was kind of as if the crew was reporting something far more unsettling than just a routine disappearance. So following the telegraph, an investigation was launched by the Northern Lighthouse Board. But the official conclusions, I feel like there's a lot of holes in their explanation, and it doesn't really satisfy a lot of the deeper questions about what happened to those 3 keepers. After surveying the scene, the board suggested that the disappearance was likely due to a violent storm that struck the island around the time of the light's failure. They theorized that the storm's freak wave had swept the keepers away, dragging them into the sea, and perhaps forcing them to leave the safety of the lighthouse in a desperate attempt to secure the island's equipment or to rescue themselves. But here is where it gets complicated. Despite extensive searching, no bodies were ever found, and none of the crew's personal items were ever recovered from the sea. The lack of any evidence of foul play, also combined with those weird entries from the logbook, the prayers, the crying, it was not addressed by this investigation at all. And the findings just left all of these questions, like I said. Why did they leave the lighthouse? Why did they break protocol? What did they witness that led them to these strange final moments? So the official conclusion of the Lighthouse Board, like I said, was that it was likely just this tragic accident caused by the storm and rogue waves. But it's clear that even in the board's final report, that there was nothing definitive that could account for these men just completely vanishing. The weather during the final days of December 1900 was in many ways a character in this story as well, just this silent, unseen force that both concealed and revealed the fate of the 3 lighthouse keepers. As we know, the Flannan Islands lie off the western coast of Scotland, where the North Atlantic churns relentlessly. But on December 12th, when the Hesperus first passed the island and noticed the light was out, the conditions were really calm. The sea was smooth and the skies were clear, far from this huge storm that one would expect from reading the logbook. However, this calm was only a precursor to the weather that would take hold a few days later. The logbook entries note that a fierce storm hit the island around December 13th, with winds so strong that it forced the keepers to stay inside. The log reports were written in an unsettling tone. Thomas Marshall, one of the keepers, was quiet throughout the day, and Donald MacArthur, he's described as being in tears. The men appeared to be gripped by something far more than just a physical storm outside. I mean, remember, these are experienced keepers. Like, they are used to storms. They're used to the isolation. They're used to this job. They're not newbies. But something about this particular storm had them so freaked out that one of them was in tears. One of them was quiet and keeping to himself. Like, it just seems strange to me that this particular storm had this kind of effect on these weathered lighthouse keepers. Then, on December 14th, the weather cleared, the wind died down, and the seas became unusually calm again. It was the perfect moment for the keepers to kind of tend to the lighthouse, resume their duties, check all the equipment, but the light remained unlit, and the men didn't emerge from their quarters. So by the time that the Hesperus arrived on December 26th to check on the island, a 3rd storm had passed. But when they got there, conditions were serene again. Clear skies, calm seas, and just this eerie stillness. It was the kind of weather that would have made it possible to see the lighthouse from a great distance, and yet it was also the perfect kind of weather for a sudden disappearance. The discrepancy in the weather, calm seas followed by sudden brutal storms, it paints this kind of strange picture. It's kind of like nature itself was just playing tricks on these guys and making them believe that they'd weathered the worst, only for something even bigger, some greater force to claim them without a trace. So we're going to talk about a couple of the theories of what happened to these keepers. The first, of course, being what the official claim is, and that is that they were swept away by some type of rogue wave. And the western side of Eilean Mor is where the lighthouse landing platform is, and there's also a crane located there that is kind of exposed to the open Atlantic Ocean. So winter storms could sometimes generate really tall waves, enough to crest the cliffs themselves, even on relatively calm days as the storm had passed. These waves were not uncommon. If the keepers had been out there, securing supplies and checking damage after these storms, and a sudden rogue wave swept in, they could possibly have been dragged into the sea before they had time to cry out. There was physical evidence supporting this idea. There was a iron railing that was twisted. Some of the ropes had been snapped and their supply crate had been smashed in pieces. 2 of the 3 rain slickers that the men used when they usually went outside in foul weather were also missing from the lighthouse. So this indicated that maybe they'd gone out to explore the damage after the storm and had been caught up in a rogue wave. But then that leaves me with this question. Why was there only 2 slickers gone? If one man had stayed behind, which was the protocol, then where is he now? Why is he nowhere to be found? And if he hadn't stayed behind, why didn't he take his rain slicker with him? So this theory doesn't quite make sense for me. There's also no sign of bodies found in the water or on the island ever. And given the rough seas, you would expect to find at least some debris, or at the very least, like personal items washed ashore. But not even the men's clothing or belongings were ever recovered. And additionally, the calm weather preceding and following the storm just makes this theory seem less likely. So the second theory is that there was some type of psychological breakdown and that the men turned on each other. This theory kind of suggests that the men succumbed to the island itself, like psychologically, emotionally, maybe even spiritually. And it suggests that like the isolation and just the strange conditions of Flannan Island itself, compounded with their own fears of being there during this storm, might have just led the keepers to an unexplained breakdown. Now, let me explain. The Flannan Islands, they're not just geographically isolated, but like I mentioned before, they're also surrounded by all of these strange stories and like this deep folklore, the idea of an island that like drives men mad. And that kind of fits into this eerie history of this particular island. The island's remote location and the harsh conditions, combined with its dark past, it might have just created like this perfect storm and this environment that triggered a psychological spiral for these keepers. I mean, you think about it, there's this oppressive silence, constant wind, the whistling sounds of the sea. They could have just chipped away at the sanity of these men who were left in complete isolation for months at a time, having no human contact for long stretches of time until it broke them. I mean, we know that Donald MacArthur, one of the keepers, was described as somewhat of a loner, and it's possible that the psychological toll of the islands was especially hard for him. In the days before the disappearance, his behavior is reported as erratic. There are accounts that he was unusually upset, that he was crying uncontrollably, maybe overwhelmed by the isolation. And the idea of succumbing to the island doesn't really seem that far-fetched to me if you consider that MacArthur had been under this kind of stress for months. Like, these men were on this island by themselves, complete isolation for months. So was his breakdown that's described in the logbook a sign of like mental exhaustion? Did the constant pressure from isolation ultimately just push him over to the edge? And perhaps if that's the case, in his disturbed state, he might have felt compelled to like leave the safety of the lighthouse, believing there was something that was amiss, or maybe he was having hallucinations or something of that nature. And while this theory of the island driving men mad has its merit, there is one problem. The complete absence of evidence that any of the keepers showed extreme psychological distress to the point of making irrational decisions. I feel like that would have been recorded in the logbook. That like, I know that they recorded him crying and being withdrawn, but like not to the point of having a severe mental breakdown in the days leading up to the lights not shining and the men disappearing. Furthermore, the pristine state of the lighthouse, like there's food prepared, there's lamps filled with oil, and that seems to suggest that they left willingly rather than being in like a panic or a state of psychological collapse. However, it is worth noting that like the logbook that we have is just this like brief little snapshot of the days leading up to this incident. And we really don't know, like, the psychological toll that the isolation had on these men. And we really don't know what their mental state was. So I feel like this is maybe a valid theory that this is what happened. Now, the next theory, it happens every time something weird like this happens. And that is, some people believed that this was paranormal. That this had something to do with the paranormal, that the keepers had been taken by something unseen, like aliens or some type of wild animal or something like that. The reason why I don't think that this is the case is because there really isn't any evidence to suggest that anything unusual happened. There's no remains, there's no sign of abduction, there's no records of seeing ships nearby or anything like that. And I feel like this is another classic case of people just like grasping at straws to try to find some type of answer to explain this seemingly unexplainable incident. The next theory is that they came in contact with smugglers. The Flannan Islands had a history of smuggling activities, with contraband goods being hidden in the caves along the coastline. So is it possible that maybe the keepers like stumbled upon something that they shouldn't have seen related to this smuggling operation? It's possible. Was it smugglers that took them, maybe to keep them from reporting their findings to authorities? Or was their disappearance part of a larger plot? This to me sounds more of like a conspiracy theory, and there really is no evidence connecting the keepers to any type of smuggling activity. There's no reports or sightings that suggest that there was any ships that stopped by the island during this period. And also, a smuggler would really have no reason to leave the man's belongings untouched or to allow this relief ship to come to the island and board the island without any type of backlash. It seems too risky, and the lighthouse is too far removed to be directly involved in any sort of like high stakes operation. It's too far out there, too isolated. So in 1971, the Eilean Mor lighthouse became automated, and they didn't need to have keepers on the island anymore to make sure that the light kept glowing for passing ships. So the truth of what happened to the men of the Eilean Mor lighthouse may never be known, and that's kind of what makes this story so haunting. The official conclusion from the lighthouse board kind of just leaves gaps and questions. And you've got these strange logbook entries, the eerie calm before the storm, and the missing keepers. And I feel like all of these things suggest a lot deeper of a mystery than just they were swept out to sea by a rogue wave. So what did happen on the island? What made the lights go out? As we'll never know, the ghostly silence of Eilean Mor will continue to echo, a warning to all who pass nearby. A lighthouse in the dark, its keepers lost to time, and the mystery of what happened to them still very much alive. Thank you so much for joining us today for this eerie tale, and I would love to know what your theories are. I think I'm leaning more towards some type of disagreement towards the men. I think that's where I'm at right now, but I'd love to know what you think. Let me know on my Instagram on the post for this episode. My Instagram handle is @SheInvestigatesPod. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider giving me a 5-star review or subscribing. And we will be back with another episode next week. And until then, I'll be snooping, so you don't have to. This is She Investigates, signing off.